And so, you know, you have the CNN with these poor old fogies who are supposed to be experts in counter-terror or peace processing or whatever you're supposed to do. And this is just preposterous journalism. This is treating you like children. The French have a great word which doesn't really marry up in English. It's infantilisme, which doesn't mean childishness, it means babyishness. I'm amazed, and maybe you can explain this one to me in the form of a question, if you can make me understand it. From sea to shining sea, you have undoubtedly the best funded, the best taught universities in the world. There are some exceptions, I know, and one or two academics, etc. But by and large, you do. You have this wealth of knowledge. Yet, when I call the State Department, the person who talks to me is talking in the language of babies. All this knowledge of the Middle East, you have departments of Middle East studies, Islamic studies, Hebrew studies. There's no end to the knowledge you have, the pools of knowledge and the wealth funded into it, the billions of dollars which we don't have to put into our universities. And yet, when your government speaks, it is knowledge free. They are liberated from you and from all you learn. What is it that stops this gem, this pearl of understanding which you all contribute towards in this college, in all the universities of America? What is it that when you look to US foreign policy, it bears no relation at all, either to your wisdom or to the place I live in, which is called the Middle East? This is what went wrong on 9/11. I've said this before in Sacramento, so if anyone's heard me say it before, this is a repeat for 2 minutes. You know, after 9/11, when I was trying to cross the Atlantic and the plane turned round, I ended up in this ridiculous conversation with a well-known Harvard academic who shall not be named. It's Alan Dershowitz, of course. And he was on the line, and I started saying, hold on, you keep saying, you know, who are the... It's all right to ask who did it. You know, 19 Arabs who claim they were Muslims. It's all right to say how, box cutters, tall buildings, aeroplanes. But then I asked, why don't we ask why? To which Dershowitz said, Mr. Fisk, you are a dangerous man. To ask the question why is pro-terrorist, anti-American, and that is the same as being anti-Semitic. That's it, see? And, of course, the problem here is that when you have a crime, well, not in the streets of Sacramento, but when you have a crime anywhere in the world, the first thing the cops do is look for a motive. When you have an international crime against humanity like 9/11, the one thing we journalists were not supposed to do was look for a motive. Like, Arabs, do they come from the Middle East? Is there a problem there? You see? And of course, that means an examination of America's relationships with the Middle East and then America's relationship with Israel. Blah, the last taboo, as the late Edward Said so rightly called it. But there you go. Here's another piece of media cowardice that makes my 64-year-old teeth grind together after 34 years of eating hummus and tahina in the Middle East. We are told in many analysis features that what we have to deal with in the Middle East are competing narratives. The competition bit is the bit you're supposed to sort of just absorb, right? Very cozy. There's no justice, no injustice, just a couple of people who tell different history stories. Competing narratives now regularly pop up in the British press. The phrase is a species or subspecies of the false language of anthropology. I'll tell you a terrible secret. About 2 years ago, I was offered the possibility of being an adjunct professor, whatever that is, certainly Dershowitz would be better than that, in a university in Britain where the department would be dedicated to sort of some kind of peace context. And after a couple of minutes of listening to the provost explaining what this role might be, it was quite clear. You get a bunch of poor old Israelis and sit them down, and a bunch of poor old Palestinians and sit them down, and they'd rant at each other, and then you say, hold on, I think we have some common ground. It doesn't work, you see. But this is all about competing narratives, deleting the possibility that one group of people, in the Middle East, for example, are occupied, while another group of people are doing the occupying. Again, no justice, no injustice, no oppression or oppressing, just some friendly competing narratives, a football match, if you like, level playing field, because the two sides are they not in competition? And that is why your Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, can say, we will do everything we can to bring peace to the region, but it is up to the parties themselves to make the sacrifices. Only one of them happens to be occupying the other people's land, which doesn't come into the narrative. So an occupation becomes a dispute. And thus a wall becomes a fence or a security barrier, which was, of course, what the East German regime called the Berlin Wall. And this wall is higher, I had a look at it a few weeks ago, and longer than the Berlin Wall. And thus Israeli acts of colonization of Arab land, contrary to all international law, become settlements or outposts, or, in the language of our journalists, Jewish neighborhoods. Outpost, like the Custer's seventh, well, he didn't do very well. It was Colin Powell, in his starring, powerless appearance as Secretary of State to George W. Bush, who told US diplomats in the Middle East not to refer to the West Bank as occupied territory, but to refer to it as disputed territory. It's occupied. I was there not long ago, 2.5 months ago. And the big thing that most people don't realize, because it's not out there in front of you, I did a whole 2-page story, but my paper, The Independent of London, runs this. 62% of the West Bank, 62% of the 22% for which Mahmoud Abbas is now negotiating as a Palestinian state, is in Area C, thank you, the Oslo Agreement, which places it under total Israeli occupation, where settlements continue to be built or thickened, i.e. natural growth within the barbed wire until the barbed wire stretches out a bit more, whereas Palestinian villages in Area C, 62%, remember, of the West Bank, 62% of the 22% that's left to negotiate over, the Palestinians, and they showed me the documents signed in Hebrew, name a bit illegible, of course, but it was signed, saying that they couldn't build any more stories on their houses, therefore the family cannot expand, therefore, of course, they'll leave to Jordan or wherever, and they weren't allowed to dig more than 3 inches into the ground. This is why, when I went round one village, there are lots and lots of telegraph poles. But, of course, they're not in the ground because you can't dig into the ground, so there's giant concrete blocks about as big as this with the telegraph pole in the concrete block, because the concrete block doesn't have to be dug 3 inches into the ground. This land is gone. At the moment, Mahmoud Abbas is negotiating for, if you take away the 62, he's negotiating for about 10.9% of what was Mandate Palestine, and that ain't enough room for a state. I don't think it's going to happen. More and more, since particularly my last visit to Israel as well, of course, because I fly into Israel, I've come to the conclusion there is going to be a one-state solution, and it's likely to be called Israel. And the Palestinians, those who haven't despaired and left, will be the Gastarbeiter, the workforce, to keep on building more settlements, more colonies. I don't see any hope there. I see Mr. Blair still beaming. He's done nothing for Gaza. He's only been twice to Gaza in, 4 years? Part of the fantasy world. Peace, it's okay. It's not. There is no peace. And I don't think there's going to be. I'm saying this because I think that unless people understand the situation, how grave it is, they won't be able to come up with any idea to resolve what continues to be an incendiary center of the Middle East crisis.